The chair appeared before its owner did, and that was the thing Etta Barrett would never quite be able to explain to people who asked how it all began. It was the summer of 1882, deep in the heart of the New Mexico Territory, where the Rio Grande cut through Red Canyon walls, and the sage-scrubbed land stretched out in every direction like a bolt of sun-bleached linen rolled from one horizon to the other. The town of Morrow Creek had been carved out of the desert by stubborn hands and stubborn faith, and every August the surrounding ranching families gathered for what the locals called the Cattlemen Social, a tradition going back 15 years, when the first settlers had decided that surviving the wilderness was reason enough to celebrate. Etta had not wanted to come. She had dressed in her best cotton blouse, white with small blue stitching at the collar that her late mother had embroidered, and her dark skirt, and she had braided her chestnut hair with fingers that shook slightly, because today was not merely a social occasion. Today was the first time she would appear in public as the sole proprietor of the Barrett homestead. Her father, James Barrett, had passed from a fever in late April, leaving Etta at 24 years old to manage 240 acres of grazing land, a modest adobe house, 63 head of cattle, and a foreman named Percy who drank too much but worked hard enough to compensate. She had every right to grieve quietly at home. But Percy had looked at her across the breakfast table that morning and said, with unusual gentleness for a man of his rough manner, that her father had never missed a single cattlemen's social in his 19 years in Morrow Creek, and that showing up today would honor him more than any amount of sitting in a dark room. So Etta came. The gathering was held in the wide flat field behind the mercantile, where someone had strung lanterns between cottonwood posts even though it was midday, and the lanterns would not matter until dusk. Long tables had been set up and covered with checkered oilcloth, and women were already spreading out dishes of food: roasted corn, dried peach cobbler, bean stew, and enough biscuits to fill a wagon bed. The men moved in clusters, talking cattle prices and land deeds, and the drought that everyone agreed was going to last another season. Children ran underfoot. Fiddle music had started up near the east edge of the field, bright and ragged and cheerful. Etta arrived with Percy beside her, and she felt the eyes find her before she had fully stepped through the gate. Not unkind eyes, most of them were sympathetic. Many were people who had known her father. But they found her and they weighed her, and she could feel the question moving through the crowd like a ripple across still water. What is going to happen to the Barrett land now? She lifted her chin and kept walking. The problem with the Cattlemen's Social, which Etta had attended every year since childhood, was that there was never enough seating for everyone at once. The men stood and the women sat, or the women stood over the food tables, or everyone shifted and shuffled, and by mid-afternoon backs ached and feet burned in the heat, and people found fence rails and wagon tongues and cooler boxes to perch on. It was not an elegant arrangement, but it was the tradition, and nobody had ever thought to question it. Etta found a seat on a low wooden bench near the pie table, but within 20 minutes Mrs. Harlan Oakes, a formidable woman of 60 who had been sitting there since before the fiddle started, informed Etta with a smile that was not particularly warm that the bench was needed for the older women, and perhaps Etta might find somewhere else. Etta smiled back with equal precision and moved away. She walked to the far side of the field, near a line of cottonwood trees where the shade collected in a thin strip, and stood there for a while watching the crowd. Her feet hurt in the boots she rarely wore anymore. Her lower back ached from the morning's work before she had changed her clothes. She would have liked very much to sit down. There was nowhere to sit. She was contemplating the social acceptability of sitting on the ground, which was zero. She already knew the answer when she noticed it. A wooden chair sat at the edge of the shade, set apart from the gathering in a way that was too deliberate to be accidental. It was not a remarkable chair. It was a ranch chair, solid, plain, with a straight back and 4 legs sturdy enough to withstand years of hard use. It had been placed facing the field, positioned at just the right angle to catch the breeze that came through the cottonwoods and to observe the gathering without being swallowed by it. And on the seat of the chair, folded neatly, was a small square of muslin as a cushion. Etta looked at it. She looked around to see whose chair it was. There was no one near it. The surrounding area was empty of people. The closest figure was 30 feet away. She looked at the chair again. It was such a thoughtful thing. The cushion troubled her more than the chair itself. Someone had thought about comfort. Someone had not simply dragged a chair out here but had considered that the person sitting in it might appreciate a little softness against the hard wood. It was the kind of detail that spoke of a specific, careful mind. But whose? She was still working out that question when a voice came from slightly behind her and to the left. "It is for you, if you would like it." She turned. The man standing there was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a year or two older or younger. It was hard to tell exactly, because he had the kind of face that the sun and wind had worked on with their particular artistry, lending him a quality of settled solidity that could belong to 28 or 33. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who spent their days in physical labor, and he wore a plain brown coat over a shirt the color of dry creek mud, with a battered hat in his left hand that he had removed when he spoke to her. His hair was dark with a single thread of early gray at the left temple. His eyes, when she found them, were a quiet shade of gray-green, like sage after rain. He was looking at her with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely serious and somehow, inexplicably, entirely kind. "I beg your pardon," Etta said, because she had not quite caught his meaning in the surprise of being addressed. "The chair," he said with a small gesture toward it. "I brought it from my wagon. I noticed when I arrived that there was not enough seating on this side of the field and that the ground is uneven over here. I thought it might be needed." He paused. "I set it there about 20 minutes ago. I have been watching to see if you would take it." Etta blinked. "You have been watching me." "I have been watching to see if anyone needed it," he corrected, with a precision that was not unkind. "You were the first person who came to this side of the field, and stood still long enough that I thought you might be looking for somewhere to rest." It was, she thought, one of the most unusual explanations she had ever received for anything. That is, she started and then stopped because she did not know exactly what to call it. Peculiar, considerate, both simultaneously. "That is very thoughtful," she finished, which was honest at least. "My mother always said that a man who does not think about where the women are going to sit has not thought hard enough about the gathering," he said, with the faint quality of someone quoting from a source they hold in deep regard. "I have not been able to undo that lesson." Etta found herself smiling before she had entirely decided to smile. "Thank you," she said. "I will accept it gratefully." "Gilbert Thatcher," he said, extending his right hand. "I run the Thatcher spread about 12 miles north of town." "Etta Barrett," she said, and took his hand. His grip was firm and brief and entirely respectful, and when he released her hand he settled his hat back on his head and said, "I was sorry to hear about your father, Miss Barrett. He was a good man. He spoke well of his land and better of his daughter." The words landed somewhere deep in her chest and sat there, warm and steady. "You knew my father?" she asked. "I met him 3 times at these gatherings and once at the feed store in February," Gilbert said. "Not enough to call a close acquaintance, but enough to form a clear impression." What impression was that? He considered the question with what she was already beginning to recognize as his characteristic seriousness. Nothing was answered quickly by this man. She could already tell. Everything was given the weight of honest consideration. That he was a man who had built something real, Gilbert said, and that he was very proud of the daughter who was going to carry it forward. Etta looked away toward the field, where the fiddle had picked up a faster tune, and several couples were beginning to move in the open space between the tables. Her eyes burned slightly, which she would not permit in public, and she pressed her lips together until the feeling passed. "You should sit down," Gilbert said very gently. "The cobbler over there is being served and you look like you have been standing for some time." She sat in his chair. He stood nearby, not hovering, not crowding, but present in a way that felt like a windbreak feels solid and useful without announcing itself. He watched the gathering and she watched the gathering, and after a while they began to talk, not about anything urgent or revealing, but about the drought and the price of beef, and the new doctor who had come to Morrow Creek last spring, and whether he seemed competent. It was the conversation of two people who are still making up their minds about each other but have quietly decided the process is worthwhile. At one point, Harlan Oakes came over and shook Gilbert's hand and told him he had heard the Thatcher herd was looking strong this year. And Gilbert nodded and said it was coming along. And then Harlan said something about the Barrett land under his breath with a tone that implied he considered it a property in uncertain hands. And Etta saw Gilbert's jaw set very slightly in a way that suggested he had heard it and had an opinion about it and was choosing, deliberately, not to voice that opinion in the middle of a social gathering. When Harlan moved away, Gilbert said, quietly and without making a great declaration of it, "Your land is not in uncertain hands." "No," Etta said, "it is not." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and something passed between them that was not romantic in that instant. It was simply recognition, the recognition of one capable person by another. "I thought not," he said, and that was all. She was walking back to Percy and the wagon in the early evening, when the lanterns had been lit, and the field had gone golden, and the fiddle music had grown slower and more melancholy, when she realized she had not caught his full name until the very end of their conversation. She had sat in his chair for 3 hours and talked with him for most of them, and learned more about the northern range and the water situation along the river and the price of hay per bale than she had gathered in the previous 2 months, and she had been so occupied with all of it, and with the quality of his attention, which was complete and unperforming, the attention of a man who actually listens, that she had forgotten to ask his name first. She had noticed the chair before she noticed him. And now she could not stop thinking about either. Percy drove the wagon home through the blue dark evening and did not ask a single question, for which Etta was entirely grateful. She sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the stars appear one by one above the canyon walls, and thought about gray-green eyes and a plain wooden chair with a folded square of muslin on the seat. She was back at the Barrett homestead by 9 o'clock and in bed by 10, and for the first time since April, she did not lie awake in the dark worrying about the land. She thought about something else entirely. The following week passed in the way that weeks on a working ranch always pass, too fast and too full of demands to permit much reflection. The cattle needed moving to the north pasture before the summer heat peaked. The fence along the creek bottom had failed in 2 sections and required Percy and 2 of the hands to spend 3 days replacing posts. A problem had developed with the well at the south end of the property, not catastrophic, but requiring the attention of a man from town who understood such things and who would not come out until Thursday. Etta managed all of it with the practical competence she had been developing her entire life, because her father had raised her to know this land. James Barrett had been a forward-thinking man in many respects, unusual for the time and the place, and he had believed that his daughter, who had no brothers and no mother after age 12, needed to understand every aspect of running the homestead if she was going to be any use on it. Etta could read a head count, negotiate a cattle price, assess the health of a water source, and read a storm coming off the mountains with 2 hours' warning. These were not the skills the neighboring ranchers necessarily associated with a 24-year-old woman, but they were the skills she had, and she had long since decided she was not going to apologize for them. What she had not anticipated was how lonely it would be to use them without her father at the kitchen table each evening to discuss the day's decisions. On the 9th day after the gathering, a wagon she did not recognize came up the road to the homestead in the mid-morning. She was in the yard measuring fence posts when it arrived, and she straightened and shielded her eyes with one hand against the sun and saw Gilbert Thatcher on the wagon seat. He pulled up to the yard fence and climbed down with the unhurried manner of a man who is not trying to make an impression, just completing a task. "Miss Barrett," he said, with a touch of his hat brim. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, and felt something in her chest that was wholly inappropriate to a business call, which she was fairly certain this must be. "I am riding the north fence line this week," he said. "Part of it runs along your boundary. I found a section on your side that is in poor condition, 3 posts rotted out and the wire down. Thought you should know." Etta straightened further. "Where exactly?" "About 4 miles north by northeast, where the old creek bed bends." He reached into the wagon bed and produced a folded piece of paper, a rough map he had drawn in pencil, with careful markings. He extended it to her. She unfolded it and looked at it. The drawing was precise and clear, the measurements noted in a neat hand. "Did you fix your side?" she asked. "Yes." "Did you fix my side while you were there?" A brief pause. "I replaced 2 of the posts and restrung the wire on a 40-foot section," he said, with the manner of someone being honest about something they did not want to make a fuss about. "The 3rd post will need a longer piece than I had on the wagon. I marked the spot." Etta looked at the map again. Then she looked up at him. "You repaired my fence," she said, "part of it, without asking." "I was already there with the tools in the wagon," he said. "It would have been more trouble to leave it than fix it." This was not entirely logical, and they both knew it, but she did not challenge it because she was occupied with the fact that this man had ridden 4 miles out of his way to tell her about her fence, and had repaired it with materials from his own wagon, and was now standing in her yard holding his hat and looking at nothing in particular. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. He looked at her with genuine surprise, as if the invitation had not occurred to him as a possibility. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." They sat on the porch in the 2 chairs Etta kept there, and she made coffee on the small outdoor stove and brought it out in heavy tin cups, and they talked for almost 2 hours. Not about anything that felt urgent or staged, about the history of the land, about where he had come from originally, which was Missouri, where his family had farmed tobacco before his father had decided to move west in 1866, about why he had chosen cattle over crops, about the territory's complicated relationship with the large land grant companies, and what it meant for smaller ranchers when those companies had the attention of territorial officials and smaller operations did not. "Your father tried to get a petition together 3 years ago," Gilbert said, "to limit the influence of the Maxwell land grant interests in this county. I signed it." "I did not know that," Etta said. "It did not accomplish much," he said, with the honest acknowledgement of a man who had not given up on the principle but was clear-eyed about the practical results. "But it mattered that people tried." She watched his hands around the coffee cup, large, careful hands, with the particular steadiness she had already come to associate with him. He was a man who did not make unnecessary movements. He did not fidget or gesture or speak simply to fill silence. There was a quality of stillness to him that she found, and she was aware this was a specific and somewhat private thought, deeply restful. "Do you have family nearby?" she asked. "My brother is in Santa Fe," he said. "He has a dry goods business there. We see each other at Christmas when the weather permits." He considered for a moment. "And you?" "No family," she said. "An uncle in Texas, but we have not corresponded in several years. My mother passed when I was 12. My father this past April." She said it plainly because it was plain, and because she did not believe in softening facts with people she intended to take seriously. He looked at her with the quiet steadiness that was his natural expression and said, "Then you have built something alone." "My father built it," she said. "Your father built it with you," he said, "and now you are holding it by yourself. That is not a small thing, Miss Barrett." She looked out at the yard, where the 2 hands were working on something near the barn, and Percy was visible near the water trough. The land rolled away in every direction, dry and golden and enormous and hers. "No," she said quietly, "it is not a small thing." He finished his coffee and stood and said he had better get back before the afternoon heat peaked, and she walked him to the wagon, and he climbed up and settled the reins in his hands and looked down at her. "If you find you need help with that third post," he said, "I have the length of wood on my property. I would not charge for it." "I would pay you for it," she said immediately. The corner of his mouth moved. "I had a feeling you would say that. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It is exactly right." He clicked to the horse and the wagon moved away down the road, and Etta stood in the yard and watched it go, and then went back to measuring fence posts because there was always more work to be done. Percy appeared at her elbow within 3 minutes, which was a record even for him. "That was the Thatcher boy," Percy said, which was inaccurate since Gilbert Thatcher was clearly 30 years old and not anyone's boy. But Percy had been calling every male under 40 the Thatcher boy since she was young. "It was Mr. Thatcher," Etta said. "He found a section of the north fence down," Percy said in a tone that conveyed approximately 15 separate observations. "Do not," Etta said. "I have not said anything," Percy said. "You are about to say several things," she said. "Please don't." Percy was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. "He is a good man," he said. "That is all I will say." "That is already too much," Etta said, but she did not mean it, and Percy knew she did not mean it, and they returned to the fence posts. Gilbert came back 2 weeks later with the fence post, as promised, and this time she worked alongside him to set it in the ground, because it was her fence, and she was not going to stand by watching someone else repair her property if she could help it. He accepted this without commentary, which pleased her enormously. He simply handed her tools when she needed them, and held the post steady while she tamped the earth, and did not once suggest that perhaps she should go inside. They worked in companionable silence for most of the morning, with occasional conversation about the drought which was worsening, and the cattle which were managing, and the creek level at the north boundary, which Gilbert said was lower than he had ever seen it in his 6 years on the Thatcher spread. "6 years," she said. "You came out in 1876. The year of the centennial," he said. "I was 24. My father had just died and the Missouri land was being sold. I had some money from a previous season's work, and I came west with it and found this place. Were you frightened?" She asked because she wanted to know and because she thought he was a man who would give her an honest answer. He straightened and considered the horizon for a moment. "Terrified," he said, with a simplicity that made her trust him completely. "For about the first 6 months I was certain I had made the worst decision of my life. The land was harder than I had expected, and the isolation was harder than that." He paused. "But then it became something else. It became mine." "Yes," she said, understanding this completely. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she looked back, and something passed between them again. Not the recognition of that first day, but something warmer and more specifically personal. The kind of thing that has no name in practical conversation, but that both people feel simultaneously and do not remark on, because remarking on it would make it smaller. He stayed for the noon meal, because by the time they finished with the fence it was midday, and she invited him without much deliberation. And Percy cooked the salt pork and cornbread and sat with them at the table on the porch, and told 3 stories from his years in Texas that were almost certainly embellished but were entertaining regardless. When Gilbert said goodbye that afternoon, he held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she let him. The summers in New Mexico territory were not cruel exactly, but they were demanding of water and shade and patience, and the careful management of animals and land that the heat could strip of both life and value within a season. Etta learned this in her first summer as sole proprietor in ways she had not quite understood when her father was alive to absorb the worst of the decisions. The creek at the north boundary dropped further. 2 of her cattle developed signs of heat stress. The price at the market in the county seat, a 2-day ride each way, had shifted in a direction that made the fall sales figures something she ran in her head before sleeping and found troubling. She had not seen Gilbert in 3 weeks, and she was aware of this fact with a precision that was slightly alarming. When he came to the homestead on a Wednesday evening in late August, she was on the porch with the accounts ledger open in her lap and a pen in her hand, and she looked up and saw him riding in on the dark bay horse she had seen him on before, and the warmth that moved through her was immediate and unguarded, and she was glad it was evening so the color in her face would not be visible. "Evening," he said, dismounting at the fence. "Evening," she said. She set the ledger aside. "This is unexpected. I was in the south pasture today," he said. "I found 3 of your cattle on my side of the fence. I brought them back." He gestured behind him, and she saw then that he was leading a small rope to which 3 of her steers were attached, placid and apparently unconcerned about their adventure. "Lord," she said, and stood immediately to go look, because loose cattle on a neighbor's land was a matter requiring prompt attention. She climbed over the yard fence, not a ladylike thing to do, but the gate was at the far end, and went to inspect the steers, and they were indeed hers, identified by the Barrett brand on the right hip. "Which section of fence?" she asked. "The southeastern corner," he said. It was not the posts this time, it was the wire itself. The tension had failed. "I will ride out there tomorrow morning." "I can come with you," he said. "I will have Marcos available. He is my most experienced hand with fence wire." She started to say she could manage it, which was true, and then stopped herself, because the practical reality was that having an extra experienced hand would make the job faster and better, and declining help out of pride was not something her father had ever taught her. "Thank you," she said. "That would be appreciated." He nodded. 7 o'clock, 7 o'clock, she agreed. And then they were standing in the evening light with the 3 placid steers between them and the sky going through its evening gradations of orange and pink and deep violet behind the canyon walls, and neither of them moved to end the moment. "You were working on the accounts," he said, with a nod toward the porch. "The fall numbers are making me uneasy," she said. She would not have said this to most people, because most people would take it as evidence that the Barrett land was in uncertain hands, which she had already decided it was not. But Gilbert Thatcher was not most people. "The market price," he said. "Yes. I know a man in Albuquerque," he said. "Not a broker exactly, more of a middleman who knows which buyers are willing to pay above the standard rate for quality stock. I used him last year. If your cattle are in good condition by October," he looked at the 3 returned steers with the assessing eye of a rancher, "which these look like they will be, it might be worth a letter." "Would you send the introduction?" she asked. "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, not because it was hidden but because it was complex, because there were several things in it simultaneously. "Because your cattle are good and your land is good and you should get a fair price for them," he said. "And because," he paused, "because I would like to do something that is useful to you." The evening had gotten very quiet. The steers shifted and the horses moved, and somewhere far away a coyote began, but right here in this particular square of fading light it was perfectly quiet. "Gilbert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both heard it. "Etta," he said, and there it was, her name in his voice, careful and warm. "I appreciate you," she said, because it was the simplest and most honest thing, and this man responded to simplicity and honesty the way some men responded to flattery. He looked at her for a long moment. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly. If that is agreeable to you." She held his gaze. "It is agreeable to me," she said. The first proper call was on a Sunday, when he came to the homestead in the afternoon with his hat cleaned and his coat brushed and a small paper-wrapped package that turned out to contain a tin of good tea, not the rough dried leaves available at the Morrow Creek mercantile but something finer, brought from a shop in the county seat. He presented it without ceremony, as if it were a natural and obvious thing to bring, and she received it in the same spirit and made tea, and they sat on the porch until the sun dropped behind the canyon rim. He told her more about Missouri and his mother, who had been a school teacher in Columbia before she married his father, and who had given him his belief about chairs at gatherings, and also his habit of reading whatever he could find, which in New Mexico territory was harder than it had been in Missouri but not impossible. "What do you read?" Etta asked. "Whatever I can get," he said. "History mostly, some philosophy when I can find it." I ordered a volume of Emerson from a catalog last winter, and it took 4 months to arrive, but it did arrive. I have a box of my father's books, Etta said. Some history, some law. He was interested in the territorial land laws, and quite a lot of natural history. There is a book on the flora of the Southwest region that I have read 3 times. His face changed in a way she was beginning to understand, a slight brightening, a quality of genuine interest uncomplicated by social performance. I would like to see that, he said. She went inside and brought the book out, and they spent an hour with it between them on the porch, discussing the descriptions of the plants they both knew by sight from the land around them. And at some point, their heads were close together over the page, and she was aware of this with a specificity of physical attention that was entirely new and not at all unwelcome. He came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. On the 3rd Sunday, he brought a plant he had found pressed flat between 2 boards, a small flowering sage variety that neither of them had been able to identify from the book, and they looked it up together and found it in the appendix under a Latin name that made them both laugh because it was entirely disproportionate to the smallness and modesty of the plant. By the 4th Sunday, Percy had begun making himself scarce in the late afternoons. By the 6th Sunday, Etta had stopped pretending to herself that she was thinking about anything other than the moment when Gilbert would arrive. He was not a man who rushed. She understood this about him and found she respected it, even when impatience moved through her like a current, and it did move through her, increasingly in the days between his visits. He was not a man who said more than he meant, which meant that what he did say carried full weight, and what he did was as deliberate and considered as his words. Every gesture had been thought about. She knew this with certainty, and it made everything feel more rather than less. In September, the drought broke, dramatically and all at once, in a 3-day rainstorm that hammered the territory and filled every creek and dry wash and turned the roads to mud and revealed 17 new fence failures across both the Barrett and Thatcher properties. Etta was in the barn with Percy in both hands trying to calm the horses during the worst of the second night's storm when the barn door came open against the wind, and Gilbert came in with rain running off him and his hat dripping and a lantern in his hand. "Your east fence is down," he said, "completely. The draw flooded and took out a 40-foot section. I saw it riding over. You rode over in this," she said, staring at him. "I was worried about the low section," he said simply, as if this explained riding through a New Mexico rainstorm at 10 o'clock at night. "You are completely soaked," she said. "I have been wetter," he said. She took the lantern from his hand and set it on the barn shelf and said, "Come inside. You are going to dry off before you ride back." He looked as if he was going to argue and then looked at her face and apparently thought better of it. She put him in the kitchen and built up the stove and made coffee and found a dry shirt that had been her father's, a little broad in the shoulder but serviceable, while he dried off, and he sat at her kitchen table with his damp hair and the borrowed shirt and his hands around the coffee cup, and the storm roared outside and the kitchen was warm and full of lamplight. "You are always appearing in the middle of problems," she said, sitting across from him. "You always have the problems in hand before I arrive," he said. "I'm not sure my appearances do much." "They do something," she said quietly. He looked at her. The lamplight caught the gray in his temple and the green in his eyes, and he was, she thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its completeness, the person she wanted to be sitting across from in this kitchen for the rest of her life. "Etta," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not an answer to a question he had asked aloud, but he heard it. He set his coffee cup down and reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and held it with a steadiness that felt like all of him, like the man who brought chairs to gatherings and fixed fence in the rain, and sent letters of introduction and read Emerson, and quoted his mother and drove a team and kept his word in all weathers. "I do not want to rush you," he said. "You have had a very hard year and you are managing more than any one person should carry, and I do not want to add pressure to what is already considerable weight." "You are not pressure," she said. "You have been the opposite of pressure." "I want to court you properly," he said, "with the intention of—" He stopped. "If you are willing, if the time is not too soon." "Gilbert," she said, squeezing his hands. "You brought a chair to a gathering because you thought someone might need to sit down. You have been thinking about other people's needs your entire life. I would very much like to be included in that number on a permanent basis." Something in his face shifted, something underneath the steadiness, warm and exposed and deeply genuine, and he said, "I had hoped you might say something like that." "Did you think I might not?" "I was not certain," he said. "You are very capable of managing everything yourself. I was not sure you would want the company." "There is a difference," she said, "between being capable of managing alone and wanting to." He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, a gesture so old-fashioned and so sincere that it did not seem old-fashioned at all. It simply seemed like him. "Then I am asking," he said, "formally to court you, with the intention of asking you to marry me in time when you are ready." "You are already asking me to marry you," she pointed out. "I am asking you to let me ask," he said, with the precision she had come to adore. "Yes," she said, "I will let you ask, and I will think seriously about the answer." The corner of his mouth moved. "You are already thinking about the answer." "I am," she confirmed, "but I believe in doing things properly." He laughed then, a real laugh, full and warm, the first time she had heard him laugh fully and without restraint, and it was, she decided, the best sound she had heard in this kitchen since before April. The storm held for another 2 days and revealed the full scope of the fence damage, which required 3 weeks of sustained repair work across both properties. Gilbert's man Marcos was, as promised, excellent with fence wire, and he and Percy developed a professional rapport that involved very little conversation and enormous mutual respect, which seemed to suit both of them perfectly. During those 3 weeks, Gilbert was at the Barrett homestead or on the shared boundary nearly every day. They worked together and ate together and talked more than they had in all the previous weeks combined, because necessity strips away formality, and what remains is the actual shape of two people. She learned that he rose before dawn, always, regardless of the day's demands, that he had a specific whistle he used for the horses that was so effective Percy tried to copy it for an entire afternoon without success, that he was not a patient man with dishonesty. He would tolerate mistakes and incompetence and bad luck with notable equanimity, but a deliberate lie visibly changed his expression in a way that was quiet and absolute. That he had a habit of looking at the sky every morning and every evening with an attention that was not casual, that he was reading it, constantly, the way her father used to read it. He learned that she kept her father's pocket watch in her apron pocket and looked at it not to check the time, but simply to hold it. That she could not bear the smell of the fever medicine the doctor had given James Barrett in April and had thrown out the remaining bottle the day after the funeral. That she was genuinely, specifically excellent at reading cattle, at assessing the health and condition of animals with a precision that came from years of patient observation, and that this skill, which she had never advertised, was one of the finest things about her as a rancher. That she sang when she thought no one was listening, old songs, the ones her mother had sung. He heard her singing one morning when he came around the corner of the barn before she knew he was there, and he stopped and did not announce himself until the song was finished, and then he said nothing about it, and she knew he had heard because she could see it in his face, and they both let it pass without remark. She loved him by then. She had known it for some time, but she knew it definitively on the morning he heard her sing and chose to let the moment be private even though it belonged to them. On the last day of September, when the fence was fully repaired and the air had turned from summer's hammer to the clear, sharp quality of early autumn, he came to the porch in the late afternoon and sat in the second chair and said, "I told you I wanted to ask you a question in time." "You did," she said. "It has been time for several weeks," he said. "I have been making myself wait because I said I would." "You could stop making yourself wait," she suggested. He turned to look at her. The autumn light was full on his face, the dark hair, the gray thread at the temple, the gray-green eyes, the steady and specific expression of a man who means what he says and knows what he wants and is not afraid of either. "Etta Barrett," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Gilbert Thatcher, I will marry you." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the two chairs on the porch of the Barrett homestead in the early October light, and it was, she thought, exactly right. They were married on the 14th of November, 1882, in the small Methodist church in Morrow Creek, by a minister who had known her father, and who conducted the ceremony with the seriousness and warmth the occasion warranted. Percy stood on Etta's side, because she had no family to stand with her, and he did it with a dignity that cost him something, given that he was not a man who stood still in formal settings, and she appreciated it deeply. Gilbert's brother, Thomas Thatcher, came from Santa Fe for the occasion, a journey of 2 days, and arrived the night before and spent the evening at the kitchen table with them in a way that revealed a great deal about both brothers very quickly. Thomas was louder and quicker and more immediately charming than Gilbert, but the same quality of honesty was present in him, and he looked at the way Gilbert looked at Etta and nodded to himself with the satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this outcome. The ceremony was short and simple and entirely genuine. When the minister asked if they would love and honor and keep each other, they both said yes with the directness of people who had already been keeping each other for months without calling it by name. Gilbert kissed her in front of the small congregation, neighbors and fellow ranchers, and a few people from town, with a tenderness that made Mrs. Harlan Oakes, who was present and who had told Etta to move from the bench at the summer gathering, press a handkerchief to her eyes. Etta noticed this and thought, with charitable amusement, that Mrs. Oakes had perhaps not been entirely without feeling, only without enough seating. The question of where they would live required several conversations and resulted, after those conversations, in a decision that was sensible and obvious once arrived at. They would live at the Barrett homestead. The Barrett land needed Etta's knowledge and presence to run it properly, and the Thatcher spread was close enough, 12 miles, that it could be managed by Gilbert with his 2 capable hands, Marcos and a man named Duncan, with the combined support of the Barrett operation for larger tasks. The 2 properties were not merged. They remained separate land holdings, which Etta had been clear about from the beginning, and which Gilbert had agreed to without requiring persuasion. But they were worked with a shared economy of labor and resource that made both properties stronger. Harlan Oakes, and several men like him who had been waiting for the Barrett land to become available through one mechanism or another, found their waiting unrewarded. Etta found this satisfying in a way she kept largely to herself. The first winter of their marriage was the hardest in recent memory, cold, that came down off the mountains in early December and stayed, with ice storms that would have been nearly impossible to manage without 2 capable people directing the work. They were up before dawn most mornings and did not come inside until after dark, and the exhaustion of those weeks was real and physical and constant. But the evenings were warm in the adobe house, with the stove going and the lamps lit and the accounts spread on the table, and the 2 of them working through the numbers together in a way that was businesslike and also underneath the business deeply intimate, because this was the real fabric of their life. Not only the romantic declarations, which were genuine, but also the daily decisions made in full honesty with each other. He took the account ledger one evening and made a small note in the margin, a correction to a calculation she had made, and she looked at it and looked at him. "That is a considerable liberty," she said. "You were 40 cents off," he said, without looking up. "I was aware," she said. "Then why did you not?" He looked up and saw her face and the expression she was working very hard to maintain, which was mock seriousness, and he understood immediately, and the corner of his mouth curved. "You let me correct it. I wanted to see what you would do," she said. And you corrected the ledger without apologizing for it," she said, "which was correct. I respect that." He set the pen down. "You are testing me constantly." "I am learning you constantly," she corrected. "That is different. And what have you learned this evening?" "That you are comfortable with partnership," she said. That you do not defer when you know something, and you are not aggressive when you know something. You simply note the fact." She paused. "That is exactly what I need." He looked at her with the warm, unhurried quality of attention that was so particularly his. "What do you need?" he said, and it was a question that meant more than the ledger. "Someone who sees me clearly," she said. "Not who I should be or what the land represents or what use I might be. Someone who sees Etta Barrett and thinks that is enough to build toward." "Etta Thatcher now," he said gently. "Etta Barrett Thatcher," she said firmly, and he smiled. "Etta Barrett Thatcher," he agreed. "And yes, I see her. I have been seeing her since she sat in that chair at the gathering and talked about the drought without once pretending to know less than she did." "That was what caught your attention?" she asked. "The cattle prices." "The honesty about the cattle prices," he said. "Most people, most women certainly in that company, would have softened their knowledge. You said exactly what you thought. You were right about all of it." She had not known that. She had not known he had been paying that kind of attention from the beginning. "You brought the chair before you knew I was going to sit in it," she said. "Yes. You brought it because you thought someone would need it." "Yes. And I was the someone." "You were the someone," he confirmed. "And then you sat in it and talked about water tables, and I thought, this is the person." The stove popped and the lamp flickered, and outside the wind pushed at the adobe walls with its cold insistence. And inside, Etta looked at her husband across the account ledger and thought that there was no version of her life that she would exchange for this one. Spring came slowly and then all at once, as it does in the high desert, and the land showed its capacity for renewal with a fidelity that never failed to move her. The sage greening, the wildflowers appearing in the crack between the canyon rock and the earth, the cattle growing strong with the new graze. In April, exactly 1 year after her father had died, Etta went out to the north pasture alone in the early morning before Gilbert was awake. She stood in the field in the dawn light and looked at the land, the rolling acres, the distant canyon walls, the sky going from dark to the specific blue of a New Mexico morning, and she held her father's pocket watch in her hand. She did not cry. She had cried in the months since April of the year before, enough to have earned the right to simply stand and be present without grief overwhelming everything. "I am all right, Papa," she said, to the sky and the land and the memory that lived in this place. "I am more than all right." She heard the horse before she heard the rider, and then Gilbert was there on the dark bay, coming across the pasture with the unhurried ease of a man who has found the person he was looking for and is in no hurry to rush the moment. He pulled up beside her and dismounted and stood next to her, looking out over the land. "I was looking for you," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" She slipped the pocket watch back into her apron pocket. "Yes," she said, "I am very all right." He took her hand and they stood in the morning pasture together while the sky continued its slow brightening. "I have something to tell you," she said. He turned to look at her. "I went to see the doctor on Thursday," she said, "when I told you I was going to town for the dry goods order." His expression changed not into alarm but into a total, focused attention. "I am expecting," she said. "He believes late October or early November." The look that crossed Gilbert Thatcher's face was something she would hold in her memory for the rest of her life, a complete unguarding, a joy so genuine and unperformed that it was almost difficult to look at directly, the way you could not quite look at the sun. He brought both her hands to his chest and held them there and said, with a quality in his voice she had never heard before, "Etta." "I know," she said. How are you?" "I am well," she said. "Completely well. Some mornings are difficult, but the doctor says that is entirely normal." He pulled her to him with a gentleness that was careful of every possible concern, his arms around her and his chin against her hair, and they stood in the pasture in the morning light while the land moved and breathed around them. "A November child," he said. "Perhaps October," she said. The doctor was not entirely precise. "October or November," he said. "Born to this land." "Born to this land," she agreed. He held her for a long time, and the horses grazed nearby, and the morning settled over them warm and clear. That summer was the fullest of Etta's life. The pregnancy was, As the doctor had indicated, an uncomplicated one. She was healthy and strong and had been doing physical work her entire life. And while she modified what she did as the months progressed, she did not stop running the homestead, and she did not intend to, and Gilbert understood this without requiring a single explanation. What changed was more subtle. There were two people making decisions now where there had been one, and those two people trusted each other's judgment, and the result was better decisions. When Etta thought the fall cattle sale should wait until the market in Albuquerque moved, which her feeling told her it would, she said so. Gilbert weighed this and agreed, and they waited, and the market moved, and the price they got was above what it would have been in early September. When Gilbert thought the south pasture fence needed complete replacement rather than repair, he made his case and she listened and agreed, and they put the work in during August when the hands had capacity. Thomas came from Santa Fe again in August for a visit of 2 weeks, and by the end of those 2 weeks had developed a friendship with Percy that no one had predicted and everyone found entertaining. The two men spent considerable time debating the relative merits of various cattle breeds with the intensity of men who had found, unexpectedly, an equally opinionated opponent. "Your brother is a surprising man," Etta said to Gilbert one evening. "He is," Gilbert agreed. "He has always been more sociable than me. It used to bother me when I was younger. I thought it meant he was less serious. I was wrong." "You are social enough," Etta said. "I am selective," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is a different thing." He put his hand very gently on the visible curve of her belly, which had been the source of a physical tenderness in him that was entirely new and entirely right, and said, "What do you think? A son or a daughter?" "I have not decided to have a preference," she said. "That is not the question," he said. "The question is what you think." She covered his hand with hers. "A son," she said. "My feeling is a son." "Mine too," he said. Their son was born on the 22nd of October, 1883, in the bedroom of the Barrett homestead, during a night that was cold and clear with the first autumn stars sharp above the canyon walls. The doctor from Morrow Creek attended, and Gilbert was present throughout in the way that was not universal among men of the time, but was, for him, unquestionable. He would not have considered being elsewhere. She held him through the hardest of it, not dramatically but quietly, with the steadiness that was his nature, and when it was over and the doctor placed the baby in Etta's arms, Gilbert sat on the edge of the bed with his hand on her hair and looked at his son with an expression that was, she would think later, in the recurring warmth of the memory, the most open she had ever seen a human face. "James," she said, "if that is agreeable to you." He looked at her. "James Gilbert Thatcher," he said. "James Gilbert Thatcher," she confirmed. The baby, whose eyes were closed and whose face was the particular scrunched intensity of the newly arrived, seemed to have no immediate opinion on the name but would, Etta thought, grow into it. Percy appeared in the doorway because Percy had waited in the hall all night, which he would deny vigorously if asked, and looked in at the baby and said, "Good Lord," which was high praise coming from him. James was a good baby, which Etta appreciated practically, and which Gilbert found a source of endless quiet wonder. The child had his father's disposition toward stillness, and his mother's eyes dark and attentive, and already, within weeks, tracking movement in a way that suggested a considerable engagement with the world. He slept reasonably and fed well, and was by 3 months old the undisputed center of the Barrett homestead, and also, Etta suspected, of the Thatcher spread 12 miles north, where Marcos and Duncan had requested to be informed of the baby's well-being on what Gilbert privately told Etta was a daily basis. Life on the homestead arranged itself around the new shape it had become. 2 ranchers and a baby, and a loyal foreman and good hands and land that was earning its keep in the territory that was becoming, slowly but visibly, something more organized and more settled with each passing year. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had pushed its way through more of the territory, and the county seat had grown, and the old lawlessness of the earlier years was receding though not gone, not entirely, because the territory was still the territory, and the land was still big enough to hold men who did not answer to anyone. The land grant issues that had concerned James Barrett and that Gilbert had signed petitions about were still unresolved. The Maxwell land grant case had moved through courts for years, and the outcome for smaller ranchers in the region remained uncertain. Gilbert attended every meeting he could find and kept himself informed, and Etta read every document he brought home, and they talked about it with the clear-eyed seriousness of two people who understood that their land could be affected and who were determined to be informed rather than caught by surprise. "Your father was right," Gilbert said one evening in 1884, when James was learning to walk and was making vigorous use of every piece of furniture in the main room as a support structure. "The only protection a smaller rancher has is documentation and solidarity." "And a good lawyer," Etta said, watching James navigate the journey from the chair leg to the table edge with intense concentration. "And a good lawyer," he agreed. "I have written to a man in Santa Fe who Thomas recommended. He knows the land law." "Good," she said. "Write again in the morning, make it clear we are not waiting." He looked at her with a warmth that was the warmth of 500 ordinary days and evenings and mornings and the particular intimacy of a shared life. "You are very good at this," he said. "At what?" "At being here," he said. "In this life, with me." James chose this moment to fall decisively on his padded bottom in the center of the room and look up at them both with an expression of profound outrage at gravity. And Etta and Gilbert both laughed, and Etta got up to retrieve their son and deposit him on Gilbert's lap, where James immediately calmed because his father's steadiness was already a known quantity to him. She stood and watched the two of them, her husband and her son, in the lamplight of the main room, and felt something that had no single name. It was gratitude and contentment and something fiercer than either, a love that had teeth in it, that would fight for this house and these people and this land. She would fight for it, and she had the hands and the knowledge and the partner to do it. The years moved in the particular rhythm of a working ranch, the seasons marking time more reliably than any calendar, the cattle the measure of each year's success or difficulty. By 1885, the Barrett homestead had 68 head, a modest improvement on the 63 of the year Etta took it over, and the Thatcher spread had grown from its original number through careful selective breeding to 90 head of notably good quality. The two operations remained separate, as Etta had insisted, but they shared labor and resource in a way that made both stronger, and the combined reputation of the Barrett and Thatcher name in Morrow Creek and the surrounding county was one of competence and fairness and durability. James was too, and running at full speed and asking questions in the particularly relentless way of 2-year-olds, which Gilbert found delightful, and Etta found both delightful and exhausting in approximately equal measure. Percy, at 51, had cut back on the heavy work but had not agreed to stop, and had developed a system with Marcos, who now spent as much time at the Barrett homestead as at the Thatcher spread, whereby the physical demands were distributed with an efficiency that Percy called practical, and Etta recognized as Percy's method of not admitting that his back troubled him. She loved Percy in the way she had loved her father's most reliable and stubborn features, with exasperation and deep fondness, and the knowledge that some things were permanent fixtures of the landscape and were better appreciated than argued with. On a Sunday afternoon in March of 1885, she and Gilbert were riding the south fence line together. James was with Percy, who had discovered an unexpected talent for keeping a 2-year-old entertained with an old pocket knife and a piece of soft wood, when Gilbert pulled his horse to a stop and sat very still for a moment. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing alarming," he said. He turned to look at her. "I want to tell you something." She waited. He was a man who said things when he was ready, and rushing him produced nothing useful. "I think about that summer gathering often," he said. "The one in 1882. Before you arrived, I had already set the chair there. I had seen that section of the field and thought about it and gone back to the wagon and brought the chair out and positioned it and found the piece of muslin. "I know," she said. "You told me." "What I have not told you," he said, "is that when I went back to the wagon for the chair, I had no idea who would sit in it. It was not for anyone specific. I just thought there should be a chair there. Someone will need it." "I know that too," she said. "And then you came," he said, "and you stood there in the shade and I could see from 30 feet away that you were the kind of person who would not complain about not having a chair and would not accept one if it was offered with any sense of transaction about it. You would have to stumble across it. So you let me stumble across it," she said. "I positioned myself where I could tell you about it without it seeming like an offer," he said. "And then I waited to see if you would take it." "That is," she said, "an extraordinary amount of calculation for a man who claims he was simply being practical." "I am sometimes both at once," he said. She laughed fully, warmly, the laugh that this man had been drawing out of her for 3 years and that she expected he would go on drawing out of her for many more. "You saw me before I sat in the chair," she said. "I did," he said, "but I think you needed to find the chair on your own terms before I could introduce myself. You were not a woman who wanted to be approached directly by a stranger. You read that from 30 feet away. You have a very clear posture," he said. She shook her head, smiling. The horses moved in the quiet afternoon and the sage was silvery in the March light, and she thought about the girl she had been in August of 1882, grieving and tired and standing in a strip of shade at the edge of a gathering, too proud to ask for a chair and too uncomfortable to admit she needed one. And there it had been, already there, already placed. It was a very good chair, she said. "I will pass the compliment along to the chair," he said. "Where is it now?" He paused. "In the barn at the Thatcher spread," he said. "I kept it." She looked at him. "You kept a ranch chair. It seemed worth keeping." She crossed the distance between their horses and leaned over and kissed him, which required some coordination on horseback, but was entirely worth the effort. And he steadied her horse with one hand and kissed her back with the thoroughness of a man who has been asked a question and intends to answer it fully. They rode home through the March afternoon with their horses close together, and James ran at them from the yard when they came in through the gate with the full-body enthusiasm of a 2-year-old greeting the people he loves most. And Gilbert was off his horse and had the boy up in one smooth motion, and Etta watched and felt the particular feeling that had no name but that she had come to recognize as the essential texture of her life. The chair came to the Barrett homestead that spring. Gilbert brought it on the wagon one afternoon without announcing his intention and set it on the porch alongside the 2 chairs already there, and when Etta came out and saw it, she stood and looked at it for a moment. "You moved it here," she said. "This is where it belongs," he said. She sat in it. It was the same as she remembered from the gathering, solid, straight-backed, the kind of chair built to last through decades of use. The muslin cushion was worn but still present, folded on the seat as it had been when she first saw it in the shade of the cottonwoods at the field behind the mercantile. She pressed her hand flat on the muslin. "This is where I started," she said. "This is where we started," he said, settling into the chair beside her. In the October of 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter, born with her mother's dark eyes and her father's calm, and a voice that expressed itself with considerably less calm than either of her parents. They named her Clara, after Gilbert's mother, and James, who was by then 3 years old, regarded his sister with the solemnity appropriate to a new and significant development in the landscape of his life. Clara was, from the first weeks, a person of definite opinions, which Etta found hilarious, and which Gilbert said he should have expected given the particular combination of parents involved. She would grow up knowing the land the way her mother knew it, that was already clear. She reached for everything. She wanted to touch the world and examine it and put it in her mouth if possible. Percy held her and said, "Lord have mercy," which was what he had said when James arrived, and Etta thought Percy's range of reaction to the Thatcher children was narrow but heartfelt. By 1886, the territory was changing in ways that required attention. The railroad's influence on cattle markets had shifted the calculations for ranchers throughout the region. The old drives were becoming less common as shipping from closer points became possible, and the prices and timing of sales needed to adapt. Gilbert and Etta attended every meeting of the County Cattlemen's Association that year, and Etta, who had been the only woman present at these meetings for several years, began to notice that she was less anomalous than she had been other women who managed homesteads or who were deeply involved in running their family ranches had begun appearing, occasionally, with the quiet persistence of people who know they belong somewhere and are simply waiting for the room to agree. At one such meeting, old Harlan Oakes, who was now genuinely old and had mellowed considerably from his younger certainty, said to Etta across the table, "Your father would be proud." "Thank you, Harlan," she said, with genuine warmth. "That Barrett land is in good hands," he said, with the particular grace of a man who has revised a previous judgment. "It always was," Gilbert said mildly from beside her. Harlan looked at him and then back at Etta and nodded, which was Harlan Oakes' version of an apology, and Etta accepted it with the generosity she could afford now. The lawyer in Santa Fe that Thomas had recommended proved his worth in 1886, when a surveying dispute threatened the northern boundary of the Barrett homestead. A new claim from a neighboring large landholder who asserted, with documentation that looked official but turned out to be imprecisely sourced, that 40 acres of the north pasture properly belonged to them. Etta had her own documentation, meticulous and complete, because James Barrett had been a man who believed in paperwork, and the case was resolved within the year in the Barrett homestead's favor. It was, Gilbert said afterward, exactly the kind of thing he had expected and for which he was entirely grateful that they had prepared. "We prepared," Etta said. "Your father prepared," he said, "and you maintained what he built. And you helped me understand what was at stake in the land grant situation early enough to be ready," she said. He looked at her. "Partnership," he said. "Partnership," she agreed. That evening they sat on the porch, all 4 chairs occupied, because Percy had taken to sitting with them in the evenings when the day's work was done. And James sat on the porch step telling Clara a story he had largely invented about a horse that could talk, which Clara received with the deep seriousness of an almost 1-year-old who does not yet have words but has strong feelings about everything. The New Mexico sky went through its evening performance, the orange and the pink and the particular deep blue that settled in last, like a promise kept. "Do you remember," Gilbert said quietly, "what I told you the night of the rainstorm, the big one in September of 1882? "Which thing?" "She said that your land was not in uncertain hands. I remember." "I was right," he said. She looked out at the land rolling away in the evening light, the canyon walls in the distance, the creek catching the last of the sun somewhere in the north. Her father's land, her land, their land in the sense that the life built on it was shared. "We were right," she said. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had across the kitchen table during the storm more than 4 years ago, and held it with the same steadiness. The children were noise and warmth between them. Percy made a quiet sound that was probably contentment coming from him. The stars arrived, one by one, over the canyon rim. There were more good years ahead of them. Etta knew it with the particular knowledge that does not come from certainty about the future, which nobody has, but from confidence in the present, in the soundness of the land and the strength of the partnership, and the specific, careful quality of the love that had begun with a plain wooden chair set in the shade of the cottonwoods at the edge of a summer gathering. She had noticed the chair before she noticed him. She had noticed the deliberateness of it, the thought behind it, the cushion that said someone was thinking about more than the obvious. And then she had noticed him, the steadiness, the gray-green eyes, the precision of his speech, the way he heard what she actually said and not the version he expected. And the chair had led her to the man, which was perhaps the most indirect and most logical route she could have taken to the life she was living. In the years that followed, when Morrow Creek had grown into a proper town with a school and a second church and a newspaper, and when James was old enough to help with the real work of the ranch and Clara was 3, and then 4, and then running through the south pasture with her mother's energy and her father's instincts, Etta kept the chair on the porch. It weathered with the house, the sun faded it, the winter stressed the joints, but it held together, as things built honestly tend to do. She replaced the muslin cushion twice. Each time she folded it neatly on the seat, the way it had been when she first saw it. In the spring of 1888, James was 5 years old and very serious about the fact that he intended to be a rancher when he grew up, which Etta and Gilbert received with appropriate gravity and only smiled about privately. Clara was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, including the particular injustice of not being allowed to climb the fence unaided. Percy's back had finally forced him to agree to the foreman title being shared with Marco's, a transition that took 6 months of negotiation, and was ultimately resolved when Percy admitted, in a moment of unusual candor, that he wanted someone who could still lift a fence post to be in charge of the fence posts. Thomas came for Christmas and brought a woman with him, a small, precise woman from Santa Fe named Augustina who made jewelry and who regarded New Mexico with the clear eyes of someone who had chosen it and intended to stay. Etta liked her immediately. Gilbert watched his brother across the Christmas table with an expression that was quiet and complete and satisfied, the expression of a man who has seen the thing he hoped would happen finally happen. "You look like you are trying not to say something," Etta told him that evening. "I am trying not to say that it took him long enough," Gilbert said. "You took your time yourself," she pointed out. "I was cautious," he said. "There is a difference between cautious and oblivious, and Thomas is or was the second one. He arrived," she said. "That is what matters." "It is," he agreed. "It is what matters." James had fallen asleep on the couch in the main room, and Clara was asleep in her bed, and Thomas and Augustina had retired to the guest room, and the house was quiet in the particular way of Christmas night, full and warm and temporarily at rest. Etta and Gilbert sat by the stove, his arm around her shoulders, her head tilted slightly toward him. "What were you thinking about just now?" he asked. "The gathering," she said. "August of 1882. I think about it sometimes." "What about it?" "That you could have brought the chair for anyone," she said. "You brought it for no one specific, and it was there when I needed it." "It was meant to be there," he said. "You do not usually use phrases like that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But some things earn them." She turned to look at him. 36 years old now, the gray more present at his temple, the lines of wind and sun and years more visible in his face, and still entirely himself. Still the man who thought about where everyone would sit, who read the sky every morning and evening, who corrected the account ledger without apologizing for knowing the right answer. "I am very glad I sat in that chair," she said. He looked at her with the fullness of everything they had built and the fullness of what was still to come, and said, "So am I every day." She pressed her hand to his chest, the way she had learned to do, not to hold him in place. He was not going anywhere, but to feel the steadiness that lived there, the heartbeat of a man who had brought a chair to a gathering because he thought someone would need it and had, in doing so, brought it for her without knowing it was her at all. The stove crackled. The house breathed around them. Outside, the New Mexico sky was enormous and clear and full of stars, the same stars that had been there in August of 1882 when they first stood in the shade of the cottonwoods, and she had looked at the chair and then at him, and her life had turned in a new direction as quietly and decisively as a compass finding north. She had the land and the house and her father's pocket watch in the drawer of the bedside table. She did not carry it anymore. She had stopped needing to hold it. And she had 2 children asleep in the rooms above, and her brother-in-law and his woman in the guest room, and Percy snoring in the foreman's quarters, and Marco sleeping in the bunkhouse, and the herd counting well on both properties, and the accounts closed clean, and the boundary of the Barrett homestead fully documented and legally secure. She had all of this, And she had him, Gilbert Thatcher, who had put a chair in the shade before she arrived and waited to see who would need it. "Go to sleep," he said softly into her hair. "In a little while," she said. They stayed by the stove until the fire burned low, and then they went to bed in the house that sat on the land that was hers by inheritance and love and the work of her own hands. And the stars continued their old, indifferent, beautiful turning above the canyon walls of the New Mexico territory, and everything was entirely, completely, and permanently well. In the years that Etta and Gilbert would eventually tell people about, because people did ask, year after year, how it had begun, the cattlemen from the north and the woman who ran the Barrett homestead, the story always came back to the chair. Not to the romance, not to the wedding, not to the first kiss on a rainy September evening. To the chair, set in the shade before its owner introduced himself, positioned to catch the breeze, with a folded square of muslin on the seat because someone had thought about comfort. "He brought a chair," Etta would say, and the way she said it would communicate everything the bare words did not, that the chair was a way of thinking about the world, a way of looking at a gathering and seeing not what was present but what was missing, not what existed but what was needed. That a man who thought that way would go on thinking that way in every circumstance of a shared life. "She sat in it," Gilbert would say, "and started talking about water tables and drought, and I thought she was the most interesting person I had ever met." "You thought I was interesting before you thought I was beautiful," Etta would say, with the satisfied look of a woman who has known this for years and considered it the finest possible arrangement. "I thought you were beautiful immediately," he would say. "The interesting part came approximately 3 minutes later when you started talking." And she would laugh fully, warmly, in the way she had been laughing at him for years, and whatever company they were in would see the two of them looking at each other, and understand without being told that this was the real article, the kind of thing that was built and maintained rather than found and displayed. Clara grew up and became a doctor, a remarkable thing in 1905, when she completed her training, and a thing her mother had encouraged from the time Clara was old enough to ask questions about the natural world and expect serious answers. James took over the management of the Barrett homestead with the same solid competence he had been practicing since he was 5 years old, and the Thatcher spread passed to him as well in time, and the two properties that his parents had kept separate and run together for so many years became, under his hand, a single larger operation that honored both names. Percy died at 67 in his sleep on a cold November night and was buried on the Barrett property which he had called home for 30 years. Etta stood at the grave in the morning and said nothing for a long time and then said, quietly, "You were right that morning. He would have wanted me to go." Marcos stayed on and eventually retired to a small house in Morrow Creek that he spent his last years filling with grandchildren. Thomas and Augustina settled in Santa Fe, and their children visited every Christmas with the reliability of people who have been given a family worth returning to. And Etta and Gilbert Thatcher grew old on the Barrett homestead in the way that people who have chosen well and loved honestly are permitted to grow old, with accumulated knowledge and occasional argument, and the particular pleasure of a person who wakes every morning in the life they decided on. The chair sat on the porch. Not always the same chair. The original had finally given out in 1895, one leg failing irreparably during a winter that was harder than usual, and Gilbert had made a new one himself, with the same dimensions and the same plain practical design, and set it in the same place on the porch. When Etta pointed out that it was not the same chair, he said that the point of the chair had never been the chair itself. She sat in it every morning with her coffee and looked out at the land. He sat in the chair beside it and looked at the sky, reading what the weather intended to do. And every morning for years they talked about the cattle and the seasons and the children and the news from the county seat, and the books they were reading and the decisions that needed to be made, and underneath the talking was the thing that had always been underneath everything between them, The recognition, first and last, of two people who saw each other clearly and found what they saw more than enough. Outside the canyon walls, the territory was becoming a state. The century was turning. The world was changing in ways that were sometimes alarming and sometimes wonderful, and always, in the final analysis, navigable by people with steady hands and honest partners. The chair sat on the porch. The sky turned above the canyon rim, and Etta Barrett Thatcher, 24 years old, the summer she had walked to the shaded edge of a field behind the Morrow Creek mercantile looking for somewhere to rest, drank her coffee in the cool morning air and thought as she had thought every day for many years, with the particular warmth of something that had never diminished, never become ordinary, never ceased to feel like both miracle and rightness, that it had all begun with a chair, set in the shade by a man who thought about what was needed before he was asked, and placed there, in the particular way the universe occasionally arranges things, exactly where she would find it.